Hi everyone, Christians going for gold. Today's testimony is the first-hand account and true story of Operation Ivy Bells, considered the most dangerous of the Cold War and the Mount Everest of spy missions. At the end of our podcast, we'll direct you to our free site that has the CIA declassified articles.
Unless you can offer us a better proposal, I suggest we adjourn for a break.
They're playing us. They have us and they know it.
At the arms negotiation, the Russians were bluffing us. Our satellites can only see what's on the surface. But the Russians send their top secret communications through cables. Sir, we have a plan.
Look around you. Only you in this room will know the mission and where we are going. All missions have unexpected problems. But you will fix it, you will solve it, and you will make it work. And we know you'll come through and bring us back what we want. This is the sort of thing that can cause World War III. But it's also the sort of thing that can help end the Cold War.
Christians going for the gold. Christ said, "Herein is my Father glorified, if you bear much fruit. Some will receive 30, some 60, some 100-fold. Some will receive wood, hay, stubble, but some gold, silver, and precious stone." Let's go for the gold. Hi, I'm Gary Matheny. We have our podcast, Christians Going for the Gold. Now, the purpose of what we're doing here is the testimonies of brothers and sisters, and there's pastors and evangelists also, and some missionaries have some fantastic testimonies. And through the years, I've thought, I wish other people could hear this. Well, that's what this is. It's all encouragement, hearing from other people who've been faithful to the ministry, who love the Lord. It will be encouragement, some challenge, and just a good opportunity to see other people are out there serving our Lord also. Hey, be sure and hit the like and subscribe button, and I'll see you on the other side. Hi, I'm Gary Matheny. My wife Nancy and I have been missionaries here in the beautiful country of Romania for the last 28 years. So how did I go from submarine espionage to church planting in Eastern Europe? Well, I got a story to tell you. Follow me. I wanted to take a minute here to tell you something that happened when I was 18 that changed my life, really. I was in a couple bad car wrecks, both of them my fault. On the second one, I almost killed myself. And on the second day in the hospital, they called my parents up, said, "Come on down here." And I was losing blood in my left kidney, and they couldn't stop it, at least at that time. And I woke up just for a few seconds there on that second day, and I saw my dad standing next to my hospital bed, and he had this disgusted look on his face. He was upset, and he looked like he was saying, "What am I doing raising these kids?" And I loved my dad. I was a self-centered young person. Sorry to say, I didn't really care about other people's feelings, but I did care about my dad, and I loved him, and I didn't want to hurt him. And I made a decision that when I got out of that hospital, I was going to do something to please him. A few months later, he said, "Gary, you ought to go join the Navy Seabees." Well, I had no desire to join any branch of the service. I'm proud of it now, but then I didn't want to go in, and I said, okay. And he was surprised I said that, and he wasted no time. He got me in his truck, he drove me down there, and I went to Navy recruiter, and I joined for 6 years. A little while after I was on active duty, I saw somebody filling in a request to become a diver, and I asked him about it. And he said, if you're interested, you ought to fill one in. I wasn't interested, but I said, give me one, and I filled it in. Again, this was done to please my dad. He liked watching Lloyd Bridges on Sea Hunt. And I thought, this will make him proud of me and put a smile on his face. And without realizing it, I began to obey the Bible. Honor thy father, the 5th commandment. It wouldn't save my soul, wouldn't get me to heaven, but there's a promise attached to the 5th commandment which says that it may go well with thee. And things in my life started to turn around. I went to diving school, second-class diving school in Washington, D.C. It was a 10-week school, it was a salvage school, basically. And then I went to Guam for 8 months for the Navy. And then I went back to Washington, D.C. for first-class diving school, 17 weeks. They taught us underwater welding, underwater demolition, and something called heliox for deep dives. You start getting deep dives, it's too deep for scuba, it's too deep for air, and we breathe helium and oxygen. Saturation diving school, and most people never even heard of such a thing. It's a 14-week school that the Navy has, and it's for deep dives, living on the bottom of the ocean 7 days at a time, and 3 days at depth and 4 days of decompression, and each day we'd leave our underwater habitat for a couple hours. And these were working dives. I wasn't a Navy SEAL. I was trained to do working dives, deep dives for long periods of time. I made more than 200 scuba dives when I was in the Navy and almost 100 umbilical cord dives. But this rig here was the only one that would have kept me alive at that depth for that time period. The face mask was double sealed. It had one seal around our face and another around our mouth and nose, so if the face part got flooded, we could still breathe. We've gotten involved in very specialized type of diving. The only people who use this type of diving on the outside of the Navy that I know of are those for deep oil rig dives in the North Sea and in the Gulf. The equipment we had was, I have never seen equipment like that, even until this day. They were semi-rebreathers, which is something we keep rebreathing the gas over again. It would scrub the gas. But even the rebreathers that you can find today, which are quite expensive, they still put bubbles into the water. And so they didn't want anybody to know where we were at. If you have bubbles coming into the water, whether air or helium, it's going to go to the surface, it's going to make a patch in the surface, and people are going to know you're there. So they had something called a push-pull system. They pushed the gas to us, they pulled the gas back, no bubbles went into the water, nobody knew we were there. They pumped us hot water, it was 27 degrees, this is a Siberian sea, it would have been frozen solid if it hadn't been salt water. They say if you lose your hot water, you're not coming back alive. If we went halfway to the surface, we would not, we'd die. If we got the wrong gas come to us, you would die. They did have another cable connected to us that would jerk us back if they needed to. They had electrical cable coming to us. We had the headsets and the microphone. Because we're breathing helium, we sound like Donald Duck, so they had a descrambler connected to our speech, and it would sound kind of mechanical, but you could understand us a little better. And this is all 1975 technology that we were using. They filmed us inside our habitat, and they had another way of filming us outside in the water. They wanted us on TV, everything was recorded, it was all classified, and it brought home the results. There was 3 divers here in this sat dive. It lasted a few days. The water was so cold it would try to freeze the blood in your hand, and it went up your arm into your heart. They have poor visibility here, but we had worse in Siberia. With the lights, the most we could see was about 6 feet. This is the USS Halibut, my sub. It was a nuclear boat, and it's proper to call them boats, subs, or ships. When I was a kid, I'd seen the Walt Disney film 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and I've always been fascinated by the mystique of submarines. It has the most unique silhouette of any sub I know of. One time when we were in San Francisco Bay, a helicopter, a newscaster from a helicopter saw sub and made the comment it looked like it was pregnant, referring to the big bubble on the front of the sub. And then when he saw on the back of the sub what looks like a mini sub, he said it was carrying a baby on its back. That which is on the back is actually the DSRV, Deep Submergence Rescue Vessel. That was designed for a sub to pull near a downed submarine and rescue sailors, submariners off a stricken sub. Actually, ours was fake. It was a cover for our diving chamber, and it couldn't go anywhere. It was welded to the tail end of our sub.
Need some kind of report.
County 7 gain IG2 band contact. Signal strength 2, possible navigation radar. Third by parameter, analyzing.
Need some kind of...
For all you land lovers, I'm going to have to bring you up on the living conditions of a sub. Everything was crammed into them, and the first couple of weeks I was always hitting my head on some valve sticking out. The bunks were 3 bunks high. They had narrow passageways. Some of them you actually had to go down sideways to get through them. Submarines have 2 steering wheels. We not only made lefts and rights, but ascents and descents. Our submarine had several countermeasures. At least one of the tubes in the forward torpedo room was loaded with a torpedo that was a countermeasure, a non-explosive torpedo, a decoy. It would play the same sound that our submarine made into the water. It maneuvered like our submarine. If a Russian destroyer started using active sonar and pinging into the water, the torpedo, this countermeasure, would pick the ping up, amplify it, in hopes of confusing any enemy. Now, all these countermeasures are nice, but they're considered last-ditch efforts. And had the Russians found out we were there in their territorial waters, the odds were really in their favor that we wouldn't get away. There were secrets on our subs, there was codes on our subs, and it had the latest technology. And the last thing the Navy wanted was for all this to fall into the hands of the Russians. So there were explosive charges on our sub in the forward part and the aft part to scuttle our boat if we were cornered by the Russians. A submarine cannot send out a radio message because if it does, it risks giving away our position. And we had no way to talk to anybody in our family until we got back into port. There's no fresh air, there's no sun, there's no windows, there's no women, and nobody ever asks you how the weather is. I started reading the Bible when I was in the Navy, and the Bible is totally different than any other book I'd ever read, bold, and was teaching a different way to heaven than what I had believed. I thought that, hey, if there's a God, that was my thoughts back then, that I'm no worse than anybody else, so he'll let me go. And as I was reading in the Bible, it wasn't based upon what I'd done. God's way of salvation puts all the glory on God, and we don't get any of the credit. I read here in the scriptures and in other places where it says, this passage in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8 and 9, "For by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves." And I thought, well, it's got to be at least a little bit of myself. But it's not of yourself. It is the gift of God. It's not the gift of the church or the minister. It's the gift of God. And if we want it, then we have to go to the person who gives it, and that's the Lord himself. And if I was going to get to heaven, I realized that I'm going to have to do this his way. I can't expect God to change for me and make it based upon my brownie points and good works. And it goes on to say, "Not of works, lest any man should boast." God doesn't want us bragging to him about how great we are. He already knows we're sinners. About the time I was contemplating this on my free time in the Navy, but not for the Navy, in my free time I went skydiving one day, which I should have never done because I'm a little afraid of heights. And I got up there in this plane, I went out in the wing, and I'm supposed to let go of the wing. That's a very simple rule of skydiving. You have to let go of the plane to go skydiving. I think most people believe that parachutes work. I'm not too sure how many of them actually trusted a parachute. You have to let go of the plane to trust the parachute. In this story, the parachute represents Jesus Christ, and the plane represents our religion, our good works, whatever you're trusting in to get you to heaven. And you have to let go of one in order to trust the other. You just can't say, well, I won't trust, I'll just trust this and Jesus. I'll do it with both of them. You either trust in him or you're not, and the only way to trust him is to let go of your good works. When people say, hey, I believe in God, and if I'm good, I'll go to heaven, they're believing in being good. They believe God exists, but they're trusting in being good to get to heaven. You got to let go of the plane. And when I was 23, I let go of the plane. spiritually. I let go of other things I trusted. I didn't put my faith in another church. Churches are good, should be good, but I put my faith in Christ. I called upon Him. Scripture says, for whosoever, me or you, for whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. I wanted to talk to you about some of the briefings we had for our project. There were some in an auxiliary building when we were in port, and some on the sub. Some were casual, some were tents. We had a liaison officer between the Navy and the NSA and the CIA. He would brief us in civilian clothes, a suit and tie, because he was between the Navy and these other agencies. The project officers loved our sub because they could get things into it because of that huge door it had in the front of the sub without taking them all apart. They loved our sub because it could find things. It was designed to find things. It had side thrusters. Our sub could actually go sideways in the water, very slowly, but it could do that. It could hover in place. It could do things that other submarines could not do, and became the sub of choice for the projects. And they loved the project that we were doing. When a spy came in and wanted to sell some information to us, give us some information, it's extremely hard to even prove that that's true or to verify it. But what we were doing, we're getting the taps, the recordings of admirals and generals in Russia with Moscow on a daily basis. Now, on our sub, there was a few people from the NSA, cryptologists, and they would watch the recordings and kind of guided some things to make sure it got done properly. They had figured out a way to tap the cable without cutting into it. If you tap directly into the inside of the cable where the communications, the electrical current is, you short it out being in the water. And they did something called the inductive mode. We did all these taps from the outside of their cable. But to do this, you have to find the amplifier because the signal is so strong there. It gives a real good electromagnetic field on the outside of the cable. They had found that in 1974. They had actually started the taps in 1971 and only did it for a few minutes then, but just to prove it could be done. And the NSA people had figured out a way not only to get the taps from the outside of the cable, but to do it without having all these channels mixed together. It was 18 channels, military channels, and if they didn't separate them, which I thought was quite a feat from the outside of the cable, it would be like walking into a room and listening to 18 people speak at the same time. So they were able to get all that together. We knew their plans in the event of war. We knew where their subs had gone and what they had done, where they had gone to. They said it was like playing poker with somebody. It said if you knew what the other person was holding in his hand, you'd have the obvious advantage. Well, we had the obvious advantage in this, especially during the arms negotiations. If the Russians wanted to bluff us, which they tried to do sometimes they would try to trade off some system, maybe a missile system that didn't work very well or didn't work at all. And our guys could go down through the list of things we got off this recordings in Siberia, and they could ask their arms negotiators for things that their negotiators didn't even know they had. Or if they wanted to trade something off that didn't work or they were having problems with, we could say, no, it's okay, you can keep it, we don't want it. And so this was a great win for America. And it went on for 10 years. It was betrayed. But during that time, we learned how they fought, and that's still valuable today. In order to get into this Russian sea, we had to get through these islands. They belonged to Russia. The Soviets had placed an underwater listening device. Its only purpose was to listen for foreign submarines entering. We could get through there. Our subs were quieter than theirs. We also had another submarine waiting for us just inside these islands for a rendezvous. It was not expected that they would try to sink us in international waters, but it was expected they would try in their territorial waters. Gary Powers had his U-2 spy plane shot down in 1960 when he entered Soviet airspace. Each cable tapping mission required the personal approval of the president. The other nuclear submarine that was waiting for us, it was our sub, and if need be, it could be the decoy and watch out for us. While I was on the submarine, the halibut, I was struggling with a decision to serve God or not, and I was praying. I wanted to make the dive. There was 21 saturation divers on this one submarine, and only 8 of us would be chosen to make the 2 saturation dives. There were 7 days, 1 saturation dive, and then another 45 days of sitting on the bottom of the ocean, and then another 7 days for the second sat dive. And if I had my rathers, I'd rather make the first sat dive. That was connect, putting up the tapping devices, and at the end was the disconnect. And I pray about this. I mean, there was more than 8 divers who wanted to make this one of these saturation dives. And we were well trained, we were in good shape physically, and I was, and they were too, chomping at the bit to make one of these dives. I shared with a good friend I had there, Chief. He encouraged me a lot. In fact, him and that CB who first witnessed to me have done as much to encourage me to live for the Lord than any minister or Bible college or anyone else. And I needed those other things, but these 2 men who weren't even in the ministry are basically, I'm a product or result of their encouragement and pointing me in the right path, and I appreciate it very much. At any rate, I shared with Chief, I said, look, I want to make this dive, okay? And I'm praying about it. We've practiced for a year for one dive, and I want to be one of those divers. And he said, well, keep praying about it. I said, I pray about it. And every time I pray and I ask God, please let me make this dive, I get the impression, no voices, but I get this impression. And in fact, the more I pray, the stronger the impression, so I don't even hardly want to pray, that God only wants to know one thing, and that is, what am I going to do if I don't get to make the dive? And he wanted to know, you think the Lord doesn't want you to make the dive? I said, no, I don't think that's it. I believe he wants me to tell him that I will serve him even if he doesn't let me make the dive. And I try and pray again and again. If I don't do what you want, will you still do what I want? You know, if our decisions are based upon what God will give me in order to do what he wants, how strong is our love for him? And I knew if I told him I would do what he wanted, even if I didn't get to make the dive, he'd hold me to it. So I had to think about that. And finally, I got to the place where I said, Lord, I will serve you even if you don't let me make the dive. But I really want to make this dive. I tacked that on the end of my prayer. And the very next day, the diving officer walked right up to me. I mean, we're in Siberia. We're in a Russian sea a few hundred feet under the ocean there. I mean, they wouldn't even tell us who was going to make the dives until over 2 weeks past the time we were out of port. Anyway, the diving officer walked right up to me and only said one thing. He said, you're making the first sat dive, and turned around and walked away. And it left me standing there thinking how such a monumental thing to me could have been resolved in just one sentence. But I praise the Lord for that. In this photo, we got 2 divers here from our sub. They're placing a tapping device. To the right of them is something called a Rove, a remotely operated vehicle. It has filming equipment, it has lights, and it has thrusters, and it could freely move about in the water. These divers are using something we call the pod. It was 20 feet long by 3 feet in diameter. We used on our dives clamping devices. They were both used to get the recordings. What they had was a better system. It actually had a mini nuclear reactor in it, plutonium-238. It was used to store information for an entire year. The Russians did find out about this operation when it was betrayed, and they stuck it in their Great Patriotic War Museum there in Moscow. The man who betrayed this operation got 30 years in prison. Our submarine sent out this vehicle to find the transponder that the Russians had in their cable. Without the transponder, the signal was just too weak to make these taps. On the first saturation dive, which was 7 days in length, I made 2 water entries. On the first water entry, I was designated yellow diver. On my second water entry, I was designated red diver. The red diver is always the lead diver. On my second water entry, I was able to place a clamp or listening device on the far side of the amplifier that we had found. Before this time, we had only received the one-way communications, so we were able to get both sides of the communications and not have to guess what was being said on the other side. On my last water entry, towards the end of the dive, as we were putting on the listening devices, a red light came on in my face mask, and this means you got 10 minutes left of breathable gas. So yellow divers stayed behind, and I'd returned to the dive chamber. We were 200 feet away down the side of the submarine to where we needed to get back into the dive chamber. I informed topside, or the main dive control, that I had a red light. There was another problem. The speaker box where the tenders were the people holding our umbilical cables back in the dive chamber. And I had no way to talk to them. The speaker box was out. I couldn't tell them I had a red light. I couldn't tell them, help me bring in all 350 feet of this cable. When I reached the side of the sub, I went aft, and about the area where the engine room, I left the seabed floor and tried to make it up to the top of our sub. I went aft looking for the DSRV. Remember, visibility is 5 to 6 feet. And I found the first leg of this DSRV, which inside of it is our diving chamber. About that time, the main dive control was able to communicate to the people in the second compartment, our tenders, hey, bring in red diver. He's got a red light, and you need to bring in his umbilical cable. I only went a few feet, and then unexplainably, my umbilical cord just stopped moving. And then worse, I got jerked backwards. I had no idea why this was happening, why I was being pulled away backwards. A yellow diver would not have pulled my cable backwards. All I knew is I had to get back. The time is clicking away. The main dive control starts timing you the minute you have one of these red lights come on, and probably only had about 5 minutes left at this point. I made a dash off that first leg. I pulled up another 30 feet or so, made a dash so I could make it to the front part of the DSRV. And all I had to do was get on that last leg, push off it, and I'd be right there. I got some more cable. I was going to push off it again, and then unexplainably, I got jerked backwards with a really sharp pull. And this time, my face mask bangs off one of the legs there. And I found out later, while this is going on, the tenders are having the cable jerked out of their hands also. I had a thought, am I getting back? I did the only thing I could do. I pulled up a few more feet of the umbilical cord and tried one more time, and this time I made it. It was determined later there was a malfunction in my rig for the red light. There was a leaky fitting on the emergency bottle. When I entered the water, I was on the outside of all the legs of the DSRV. When I was returning, I went on the inside of the first leg of the DSRV there. I should have gone on the outside because that's the side I was on when I entered the water. As a result, I ended up wrapping my cable around that leg. And when the dive tenders tried to bring me in, it had the opposite effect and pulled me backwards. And when I pulled up on the cable, it ended up pulling it out of the hands of the tenders. But of course, I got back in. Yellow diver followed about a minute later. I'm thankful. I thank the Lord I had a part. It was a real adventure. It was a lot of fun. And we did something. On our return home, our submarine surfaced just outside of San Francisco Bay, and under the Golden Gate Bridge we were met by another naval vessel. They pulled alongside of us. The CIA and the NSA didn't want to wait for us to make port to get these recordings, and we unloaded them, and they took them, and the same day these recordings were flown to Washington, D.C. This is a picture of me shaking hands with our captain, Captain Larson, my last day in the Navy. He went on to become a 4-star admiral and was given command of the entire Pacific. After the approval by a congressional committee, I was awarded the Legion of Merit for this dive, as were all the divers who entered the water there in Siberia. Later, after I was off the submarine, I went to talk to my dad about how to be saved. I loved him. I loved him more than any other man on the planet. And it was because of him I went into the Navy and became a diver, and all those good things happened to me, which at the beginning I didn't want to do, but by doing them, they made me very happy and thankful to the Lord. And also, about that time, it was the first time I actually thanked the Lord for not letting me die in that car wreck. At any rate, my dad and I, we love each other, we get along great, but there's one subject that's really a bad subject with him, that's how to be saved. And I'd have other people say, well, you ought to tell your dad this, and you ought to tell your dad that. And I said, you ought to tell him. It's World War III. He explodes immediately and starts cussing, and it's not fun. And I'm taller than my dad in stature, but all my life he'll be up here somewhere. So it takes all my courage to witness to him. And I made a decision that if my dad wasn't going to go to heaven, it wasn't going to be because I was too afraid to tell him how to be saved. And so the Bible says on some have compassion making the difference. And I thought, maybe I could use the Navy on my dad. He'd listen. So we were outside and talking, and I said, Dad, do you remember me going into the Navy and signing up for the Seabees and all? And he said, son, that was the best thing for you. I said, it was, and I thank you for, yeah, you're right. And I said, you remember me becoming a diver, and then I was on that sub and all that classified stuff. And he goes, son, I was so proud of you. I said, I know, Dad, and I'm glad, and I wanted you to be happy. But do you know why I did those things? Do you know why I joined the Navy and why I became a diver? And he just shrugged his shoulders, and I said, well, I did it because of you, Dad. I said, when I was in that bad car wreck and you were there in the hospital, I saw how frustrated and discouraged you were with me, and rightfully so. I saw how I made you feel, and it made me feel bad. And I wanted you to be happy. I wanted to do something that would please you. And that's why I joined the Navy, and that's why I became a diver, simply to please you, make you happy. And he's listening to me, he's not cussing or anything. And I said, Dad, would you like to be saved? And he just looks at me and he says, yes. And I said, well, when you asked me to go into the Navy, you just put me in your truck and we drove right down there and I signed up for 6 years, and none of us know about tomorrow. So why don't you ask God? There's 3 things here you can ask the Lord about. One, first, you can admit to him that you're a sinner like all men. And second, that you can trust his son Jesus as your own personal Savior. And then thirdly, call directly upon Christ to come into your heart and cleanse you and take you to heaven when you die. Put your faith in him. And I asked him if he could do that, and he said, yes. And so we prayed. He liked to wear a ball cap. I said, why don't you take that off, wear that ball cap, because we're going to talk to the person who made us now. And so he repeated that prayer after me, and he did something I never heard anybody do before. He called God Sir. Now, it won't mean much probably to the average person, but hearing my dad say that, and he'd say, Sir, I'm sorry for my sins. Please forgive me. And wiped away what I believe was a tear from his cheek. And when he got done praying, I said, Dad, you meant that, didn't you? And he likes to use adjectives, And he said, well, of course I meant that. You'd have to be a blankety-blank fool not to do something like that. And I said, Dad, you don't have to use those words anymore, but I'm rejoicing that you've trusted Jesus Christ also. And as setting out to make my dad happy, honor thy father, that it may be well with me. Nancy and I here in Romania and 12 years before in the state of Washington serving the Lord has made us very happy. And I put this together because there's all kind of mix in the mix here. And I wanted to put the essential parts in there because God gave them, or they worked out because of following certain principles that he had. And I don't regret any of that. And I'm glad that I gave my life to him and to his service. Thanks for watching. I hope you'll come back. Be sure and hit the like and subscribe button if you haven't already. And I introduce you to a free site. Everything's free on it, no gimmicks. It's got a bunch of ebooks on there, a bunch of short stories, helpful videos, and much more. Please see it, True Christian Short Stories by Matheny.